lot of confusion about the sun and the moon ever since biblical Genesis talked about it. What happens in biblical Genesis, there's a line, and God made two great lights, one to light the day, the other to light the night. And this messed with people's head because many people thought, well, the moon is a source of its own light. But in fact, it's only, we know today, of course, that it is purely reflected sunlight. In fact, if you're into photography and there's a full moon out and you take a time exposure of any scene at all, and if the exposure is long enough, it'll record all the colors that you would have recorded in the daytime, and that picture will end up looking like you took it in broad daylight. Because moonlight is fundamentally the same as sunlight. It's just much dimmer. But why is it the same? Because it's reflecting sunlight. All right. So with the idea that the sun lights the day and the moon lights the night, we have these poems and lore and literature and people reciting that the sun comes out in the day and the moon comes out at night. Well, the moon is out in the daytime just as often as it's out at night. No one apparently thinks to notice that. All right. So if the sun and the moon are opposite each other, the sun is fully illuminating the moon that you see. It's a full moon. If it comes around 90 degrees, then the sun is illuminating half the moon. And then you get a half moon in the sky. And if the moon comes and the angle gets narrower and narrower, you see less and less of the moon. You say a thin crescent, then you see no moon at all, otherwise known as new moon. Then the moon passes to the other side, and the crescent shows up on the other half of the moon as it works its way in its monthly orbit. If at any time you see the sun and the moon in the sky, anybody on Earth 12 time zones away from you sees neither the sun nor the moon. Period. You should think about all the times at night that you see neither the sun nor the moon. Somebody else in the world sees both of them.
So recently I had a gentleman who asked me a question about Nibiru. And at the same time that he asked me that question, I was noticing the moon in the sky on Monday night, and I was in a quandary. So I went and did some research. And then Neil deGrasse Tyson's video popped up about the moon. So let's talk about the moon. Let's talk about Nibiru. First, let me go ahead and say Nibiru was not the cause of the eclipse that we just saw on the 8th. Not even slightly. And I'm going to break that down at the end of the video. But first, let's talk about the moon. The guy was asking me about Nibiru. I gave my answer on Nibiru. And then he said something about asking me if I was a flat earther. And I said, no. He asked me, did I believe the earth was a ball? I said, yes, it's a sphere. And then he deleted the comment or did something to the comment line in the DM so that I couldn't respond to him anymore. I guess because I'm not a flat earther, he felt like I wasn't worth talking to anymore. So into your feelings. But let me explain something about that could not happen if the earth was flat. It is very well known now that the moon rotates around almost the Earth's equator. Not completely the Earth's equator, not dead on it, but almost on the Earth's equator. And it moves with the tilt of the Earth. So the moon, at any time frame that you see it, whether it's in the daytime or at nighttime, the moon is low in the sky relatively to where the sky is. It's never going to be directly above you. It's always going to be only at a certain elevation in the sky. So therefore, it demonstrates that the moon is going around near our equator because that's what our perception of the moon is going to be. Now, the reason I was looking at a crescent moon, and we was looking at a crescent moon, and from the way we was looking on the northern hemisphere, we are looking at the moon from the top down, and that's how it appears to us from the top down, because we see the top, and so the crescent on Monday was around the bottom portion of the moon, and that is what I was looking at on my way from the gym, of how the crescent was on the bottom portion of the moon. And I was like, wow, I wonder what they see in Australia. I wonder what the moon looks like on the southern hemisphere. Because the earth is a sphere, on the southern hemisphere, our view from top down and with the crescent on the bottom, their view would be from what we call the bottom down, because they would see the crescent at the top. And this is at the relative exact same time that a person on the southern hemisphere will be looking at the moon, because they will see the crescent being at the top. Now, on a flat earth, that is impossible. That is only possible on a sphere because of our viewpoints of the moon. From the northern hemisphere, top down, southern hemisphere, you're looking at it from your top down looks like a bottom up from us. That's why the crescent was at the top and on the southern hemisphere, and the crescent was on the bottom for the northern hemisphere. That doesn't happen on a flat earth. It cannot happen on a flat earth. If the earth was flat, we would all see the same crescent would be on the same side of the moon at all times. But because of the sun's reflection on the moon and the fact that you're on a sphere, it's going to give the impression of the crescent being on the top versus the bottom compared to the southern hemisphere to the northern hemisphere. And to continue what Dr. Neil deGrasse Tyson was talking about, many flat earthers like to say, oh, we're on a flat earth because you can see the moon and the sun out at the same time. That is because the moon is on the side of the earth in that portion of its rotation so that it can reflect the sunlight. We get a new moon when the moon goes behind the earth, and then everybody is experiencing a new moon at the same time because the moon is behind the earth, not being able to receive any sunlight to reflect back on the earth. But of course, people in Genesis thought that moon was creating his own light, and that's a whole nother story of a bunch of bullshit that they just believe because they didn't understand that the moon was just reflecting light. So there is no great light that lights up the night. It is a great reflection. All the light comes from the sun that you see on the moon. It doesn't come from anywhere else. And as far as Nibiru being that ninth planet out there, I explained to him that at the time frame that his name just fell out my head. At the time frame that the man who wrote the Genesis Revisited, the ninth planet, the Lost Book of Enki, his name is not in my head right now, but at the time frame that he wrote it, and he wasn't a scholar for linguistic translation at the time, he mistranslated what Nibiru was. It was simply a mistranslation. And now that decades and decades have went by and we have a much greater understanding of that language, we know that his interpretations were not all correct, that he made many mistakes. I still recommend reading the books, but there are mistakes within his translations, and there are many different stories that he did not incorporate into his books either. Because you're talking about a story that was taught for thousands of years through different cultures. So, of course, the story changed quite often. So there are various versions of the Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian, Assyrian creation, depending upon who was telling the story and when. But as far as the planet Nibiru, I want y'all to think about this logically. In our universe of planets that we know of, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Neptune, Uranus, Pluto. Pluto's still a planet to me. None of those can support life that could live on Earth. Think about that. None of those can support life that could live on Earth. Nibiru supposedly has an elliptical orbit that goes further out than Earth. Further out than Pluto. Now, there is a body out there that scientists have found called Planet X that is exerting amounts of gravity and other forces on other planets. So they devised that there is another planet out there. Now, it could not be a planet. They leave it open for it not being a planet because we can't yet study it. If a planet that can sustain life, the Anunnaki life who can live on Earth, how the freak can they exist way out past the Kuiper Belt, way out past Pluto? Their planet would freeze to death and become an ice ball. They wouldn't be able to have water. So these stories of Nibiru having water will be impossible when they're way out there. These stories of Nibiru having volcanoes and cities and oxygen and all this stuff couldn't happen. Life that can live on Earth could not live on a planet that's way outside of the habitable zone. Think about that. So y'all have a great day. And remember always, you have to free yourself to be yourself. because your greatness is non-negotiable. Good journey. Goodbye.